In 1847, the land around the small Georgia plantation looked peaceful from the outside. Long rows of cotton plants stretched toward the horizon, and tall oak trees stood quietly along the dirt roads. People passing by would have thought it was just another southern estate, no different from the many others scattered across the region. But that year, something changed inside the main house, something that would quietly shape the lives of dozens of people for years to come. The change began after the death of the plantation owner, a man known locally as firm but unremarkable. When he died, there was no grand funeral, no dramatic mourning that lasted long. His wife, now a widow in her early 40s, stepped into a role most women of her time did not fully control. Legally, the plantation passed to her and her sons. In practice, she took charge of everything. Neighbors saw her dressed in black, calm and composed, handling business matters herself. Many admired her strength. Few questioned her intentions. Before 1847, the plantation records were simple. They listed land, crops, tools, and enslaved people as property. Names were written plainly, ages estimated, values assigned in neat columns. These ledgers were common across the South. They were tools of control, but also of routine. The widow had seen them many times before, but she had never truly studied them. That changed when she sat alone one evening in her husband's office, opened the thick book, and began reading it line by line. She noticed patterns that others had ignored. She noticed how often traders came and went, how prices rose and fell, and how the birth of a child added value without the cost of purchase. She noticed that a woman's body could be counted the same way as land or livestock. To her, this was not cruelty, it was efficiency. The system already existed. She simply learned how to use it better. By the end of that year, the ledger looked different. New notes appeared in the margins. Birth dates were recorded more carefully. Health was observed closely. The widow began asking questions of the overseer, not about discipline, but about fertility. Which women were young? Which were strong? Which had given birth before? These questions were asked quietly, without emotion, as if she were discussing crop yields. To the enslaved people, the shift was felt almost immediately. Life on the plantation had always been hard, but now it felt watched in a new way. Women noticed they were being observed more closely. Their movements were tracked. Their living arrangements were changed. Some were moved to cabins closer to the main house. Others were separated from partners without explanation. No reasons were given, but fear spread quickly. The widow's sons were still young men then, barely into adulthood. They had grown up on the plantation, surrounded by enslaved people since birth. They had never been taught to see them as equals. In 1847, their mother began calling them into her husband's old office one by one. What was said behind that closed door was never written down, but the results would soon become clear. Duty was a word she used often, legacy, survival. She spoke as a businesswoman, not as a mother concerned with morality. Outwardly, nothing seemed wrong. The plantation remained profitable. Cotton shipments increased. The widow attended church and charity gatherings. She was polite, reserved, and respected. In a society that already accepted slavery, no one looked too closely at the details. And even if they did, few would have dared to challenge a woman managing her estate so successfully. But at night, the plantation told a different story. The enslaved community whispered among themselves. They noticed which cabins the sons visited. They noticed how women were punished not for disobedience, but for refusal. They noticed children being counted before they could even walk. The ledger, locked away in the main house, had become a quiet symbol of their future. For the widow, the ledger was power. Each mark of ink represented control over life itself. She believed she was securing her family's wealth in an uncertain time.
Cotton prices were unstable, laws might change one day, but children born into slavery were guaranteed assets, at least in her mind. She did not see screams or tears when she looked at the pages. She saw numbers lining up neatly. The year 1847 ended without incident. No rebellion, no scandal, no sudden exposure. That is why it mattered so much. It was the year cruelty became organized, the year intention replaced chance, the year the plantation stopped being merely a place of forced labor and became something colder, a calculated system designed to grow human lives for profit. Long after the cotton was harvested and the fields went quiet for winter, the ledger remained on the desk, heavy, final. Its pages held more than ink. They held the beginning of a hidden truth that would not be spoken aloud for generations. And while the world outside moved on, believing nothing had changed, the people living on that land knew better. For them, 1847 was the year everything shifted, even if no one else was ready to see it.
By the time 1848 arrived, people around the plantation had started to speak the widow's name with a different tone. They no longer spoke of her only as a grieving wife. Now they called her capable, sharp, and unusually involved in business matters. In a world where most plantation women stayed away from ledgers and contracts, she was doing the opposite. She rode out to the fields, spoke directly to overseers, and reviewed accounts herself. Many saw this as strength. Few understood what kind of strength it was. She had learned quickly that society did not expect much from her morally, as long as the plantation remained profitable and orderly. Being a woman worked in her favor. Men underestimated her. Traders respected her efficiency, and neighbors admired her independence. She listened carefully when cotton buyers talked about prices. She watched how slave traders negotiated. She asked questions that sounded practical, never cruel. And because slavery itself was accepted, no one stopped to question the deeper meaning behind her curiosity. Inside the house, the office that once belonged to her husband had become her private space. The ledger was always close. She read it like others read the Bible, searching for patterns and lessons. She noticed which enslaved women survived childbirth, which infants lived, which families caused trouble. She began to believe she understood the system better than the men around her. In her mind, emotion was weakness, control was intelligence. She was not loud or violent. That was what made her different. Punishments on the plantation were fewer than before, at least on the surface. Whips were used less often. Instead, fear took a quieter form. People were moved, reassigned, separated. Decisions were explained as necessary. The widow believed cruelty did not need anger, it only needed planning. Her sons watched her closely. They had grown up seeing enslaved people as background figures, always present, always silent. Now their mother spoke to them not as children, but as heirs. She told them the future of the plantation rested on discipline and loyalty. She reminded them that the world was changing and that wealth must be protected. She never spoke about right or wrong. She spoke about survival. To the sons, obedience had always meant approval. They had been raised to please her. And so, when she gave instructions that made them uncomfortable, they did not question her authority. They were taught that enslaved people had no rights over their own bodies, no voices that mattered. What began as confusion slowly hardened into acceptance. Among the enslaved people, the widow's reputation was very different. They noticed how she watched without blinking, how she remembered details no one else cared about, how she smiled politely while making decisions that tore families apart. Some called her worse than the men because she never acted in anger. Everything she did felt planned long before it happened. Women especially felt her presence. They were summoned more often, questioned about their health, their age, their strength. Midwives were ordered to report births immediately. Infants were examined like goods. Mothers were given no time to grieve when children were taken away for work or sale. The widow believed emotion slowed productivity. She believed she was removing chaos from the system.
Outside the plantation, life continued as usual. Church bells rang on Sundays. The widow sat in her pew, dressed modestly, head bowed. She donated to local causes. She spoke kindly to neighbors. People admired how she had managed so well after her husband's death. In a society built on slavery, success was often seen as virtue. But there were moments when the truth almost surfaced. A trader once joked about how fast her numbers were growing. A visiting relative asked an uncomfortable question about births. A preacher hinted during a sermon that profit should not come at the cost of the soul. Each time, the widow responded calmly. She laughed softly, changed the subject, or quoted scripture. People did not push further. It was easier not to know. She began to see herself as different from other plantation owners, smarter, more controlled. She believed men allowed desire and violence to cloud judgment. She believed she had removed emotion from the process entirely. In her mind, that made her superior. She did not see herself as cruel. She saw herself as realistic. At night, when the house was quiet, she sometimes sat alone with the ledger open before her. Candlelight flickered across the pages filled with names and numbers. She told herself she was protecting her son's future. She told herself the world demanded hard choices. If she ever felt doubt, she buried it under calculations. For the enslaved people, hope became dangerous. They learned to speak less, to watch more. They learned that silence was survival. Some prayed, some planned escape, some simply waited, counting days without knowing why. Children were born into a world already decided for them, their names written in ink before they could speak. By the end of part 2 of this story, the widow's reputation was firmly set. To the outside world, she was a rare example of a woman who mastered a man's world. To those trapped on her land, she was something else entirely, a reminder that cruelty did not always shout. Sometimes it wore a calm face, held a pen, and smiled politely while turning lives into property. This was the stage being set. The system was now in place, and what came next would no longer be quiet.
By the time the widow's sons reached their early 20s, the plantation no longer felt like a childhood home. It had become a place of rules, silence, and unspoken expectations. They had grown up walking the same paths, seeing the same faces, yet something inside them had hardened over the years. Their mother had shaped that change carefully, one lesson at a time. From a young age, the boys were taught obedience above all else. Their mother believed discipline was love. Questions were discouraged. Feelings were seen as weakness. When they were children, this meant strict schedules, long lectures, and punishment for even small acts of disobedience. As they grew older, the lessons became darker. She taught them that power was their birthright, and that responsibility meant doing whatever was necessary to protect the family name. She often spoke to them about the world beyond the plantation. She warned them that abolitionist ideas were spreading, that laws could change, and that their future was not guaranteed. A man who hesitates loses everything, she told them. Her voice was calm, but her words carried weight. She reminded them again and again that enslaved people were property, no different from land or livestock. This idea was planted early and watered often. The sons did not grow up cruel in the loud, violent way people imagined. They laughed, rode horses, and attended social events. To outsiders, they looked like ordinary young men of their class. But inside, they had learned to turn off parts of themselves. Sympathy was dangerous. Guilt was useless. Their mother made sure they understood that survival required sacrifice, even if that sacrifice belonged to others. As young men, they were brought into the business side of the plantation. Their mother showed them the ledger, explained prices, births, and losses. She spoke to them as equals now, not as children. She told them that the future of the estate depended on careful planning. She never used words like abuse or force. She used words like duty, growth, and legacy. At first, the sons felt confusion. They noticed how their mother's instructions placed them in situations that made them uneasy. They avoided eye contact with one another. They told themselves they were misunderstanding things. But each time doubt appeared, their mother stepped in. She reminded them who they were. She reminded them who held authority. And slowly, confusion turned into silence. On the plantation, the enslaved people noticed the change immediately. The sons were no longer just passing figures. They were sent to specific places at specific times. Orders came directly from the main house. Refusal was not an option. When women resisted, punishment followed, not always physical, but devastating in other ways. Families were threatened with separation. Children were taken away. Fear did the rest. The sons rarely spoke about what they were doing. They learned from their mother's example that silence was protection. At meals, conversation stayed polite and shallow. Business was discussed, but never details. The plantation ran smoothly on the surface, which only strengthened their mother's belief that she was right. Over time, the sons became trapped by the very system they helped enforce. Obedience to their mother had become habit. Disobedience felt impossible. Even when shame surfaced, it was buried under routine. Each day looked like the one before, and routine has a way of turning horror into normalcy. The widow watched them closely. She corrected their behavior when they showed hesitation. She praised them when they followed orders without question. She believed she was shaping men who would survive a changing world. In her mind, she was not destroying them, she was preparing them. She never considered the damage done to their souls because she did not believe souls mattered in business. Among the enslaved people, the sons were spoken of in whispers. Some saw them as weak, controlled by their mother. Others saw them as monsters. Most saw them as tools of a system that had already decided everyone's fate. Mothers warned their daughters. Elders prayed for protection. Hope became something people kept hidden, like a fragile object that could break if exposed. There were moments when the sons almost broke away. A look held too long, a pause before following an order, a night spent awake, staring at the ceiling. But each time, fear pulled them back. Fear of their mother, fear of losing status, fear of being cast out of the only world they knew. Their mother sensed these moments. She tightened her grip, not with anger, but with control. She reminded them of inheritance. She reminded them of loyalty. She reminded them that history favored the strong, not the kind. And slowly, the sons learned to quiet whatever part of themselves still questioned her. By the end of this stage of the story, the plantation had changed forever. What began as control over land and labor had become control over bodies and futures. The sons were no longer just heirs, they were instruments, and the woman who raised them believed she had succeeded. But deep beneath the quiet order of the plantation, something was cracking. Guilt does not disappear, it waits, and the choices made under obedience would one day return in ways none of them could control.
By the early 1850s, the changes on the plantation were no longer small or hidden. What had started quietly in ledgers and whispered orders now showed itself in numbers that could not be ignored. Children were being born at a rate far higher than on neighboring plantations. Cabins were fuller. Cries of newborns filled the night air more often than before. To the widow, this was proof that her system was working. To the enslaved people, it was a living nightmare that never seemed to end. The widow began calling this growth natural progress. She told traders and neighbors that her plantation was simply well managed. She claimed better food, better conditions, and better discipline. Some even believed her. In a society where enslaved people were treated as property, few questioned why so many children were being born without recorded fathers. The answers were uncomfortable, and discomfort was easy to avoid. Inside the plantation, fear ruled daily life.
Enslaved women understood that their bodies were no longer their own in any sense. Choices had been taken from them completely. Refusal brought consequences that reached far beyond themselves. A mother who resisted could lose her children. A woman who spoke too loudly could be sold away from everyone she knew. Silence became the only shield they had. The widow watched everything from a distance. She rarely involved herself directly. Instead, she gave instructions and expected results. Births were reported to her immediately. Names were written down quickly, almost carelessly. Children were valued not for who they were, but for what they would become in a few years: workers, servants, or items to be sold. She measured their worth the same way she measured cotton yields. The sons followed the path laid out for them. By now, obedience had replaced thought. They moved through their days with a strange emptiness, doing what was expected, avoiding reflection. Some nights they drank heavily. Other nights they stayed awake, haunted by thoughts they refused to name. But each morning the routine returned, and routine pushed everything else aside. Among the enslaved people, stories spread quietly from cabin to cabin. Older women tried to protect younger ones. Mothers clung to their children, knowing they might be taken at any moment. Fathers were left powerless, forced to watch their families torn apart by decisions made in the main house. Rage had nowhere to go. Grief had no language that could be spoken safely. The plantation appeared calm from the outside. Fields were productive. Work was orderly. There were no uprisings, no public punishments that might attract attention. This was exactly how the widow wanted it. Violence, in her view, brought risk. Control brought profit. She believed fear was most effective when it was quiet and constant. Occasionally, an overseer or trader would raise an eyebrow at the growing numbers. The widow had answers prepared. She spoke confidently, using terms she knew would satisfy men who cared only about results. She framed everything as efficiency. And because the system of slavery already accepted the buying and selling of human beings, her explanations were enough. Inside her mind, she believed she was smarter than everyone else. She told herself she had removed chaos from the process. She believed she was building something stable in an unstable world. Any doubts she might have felt were pushed aside by columns of numbers that showed success. Profit became her proof that she was right. But the enslaved community felt the truth in their bodies and hearts. Women gave birth knowing their children would grow up in chains. Children grew up watching their mothers break under the weight of endless fear. Some tried to run, most failed. Those who were caught were used as warnings, their suffering quietly displayed so others would not try. Faith became one of the few places of refuge. At night, prayers were whispered. Songs were sung softly, filled with coded hope and hidden sorrow. Elders told stories of freedom, of lands beyond the plantation. These stories kept people alive, even as reality crushed them day after day. The widow paid little attention to these moments. In her world, numbers mattered more than souls. She rarely visited the quarters now. She preferred the safety of her office, where life could be reduced to ink and paper. Each new birth felt like a victory. Each healthy child felt like confirmation. But something dark was growing alongside this expansion. The plantation became heavy with tension. Even the air felt different. The overseers noticed it, though they did not speak of it. The overseers sensed it. Fear does not stay contained forever. It builds. It waits. By the end of this part of the story, the plantation had become a place where life was created through suffering and counted as profit. The system was fully formed now. What had begun as quiet decisions in a ledger had turned into a machine that fed on human pain. And while the widow believed she had achieved control, she failed to see one truth. Systems built on cruelty always leave scars, and scars, even when hidden, have a way of resurfacing when the world begins to change.
As the years passed, the enslaved people on the plantation learned that survival depended on silence. Words became dangerous. A single sentence spoken to the wrong person could lead to punishment, separation, or sale. So stories were not told openly. They were passed quietly, late at night, in whispers that moved from cabin to cabin like shadows. These whispers carried truth. Women spoke softly about what was happening, warning one another without using names. Mothers pulled their daughters close and taught them how to avoid attention, though everyone knew avoidance was not always possible. Older women, who had seen many seasons of suffering, became protectors in small ways, switching work assignments when they could, distracting overseers, hiding girls when danger felt near. These acts were small, but in a world with no power, small acts mattered. Men on the plantation felt a different kind of pain. They watched their families live in constant fear and could do nothing. Any sign of anger could be used against them. Any attempt to defend their wives or daughters could result in being sold away or killed. Powerlessness became a daily burden. Some men turned inward, growing quiet and distant. Others found strength in faith, leading secret prayers or songs that carried hope beneath sorrow. At night, when work was done and the plantation fell quiet, people gathered when it was safe. Fires burned low. Children slept close to their mothers. It was during these moments that the whispers grew stronger. Stories of other plantations spread. Stories of freedom spread too, places where chains had been broken, where people lived without fear. No one knew if these stories were true, but believing in them made life bearable. The widow never heard these whispers, or perhaps she chose not to. In her world, silence meant success. There were no open rebellions, no public defiance. To her, that meant control. She believed fear had done its job. She did not understand that silence can hide anger just as easily as it hides pain. The sons were aware, on some level, that something was wrong. They noticed how people avoided their eyes, how conversations stopped when they entered a space, how children flinched at sudden movement. But instead of questioning the system, they blamed the enslaved people themselves. This made it easier to live with what they were doing. Dehumanizing others was a habit learned early, and habits are hard to break. Occasionally, resistance surfaced despite the risks. A woman would refuse an order. A man would speak out. The response was swift and cruel, designed to be seen by just enough people to spread fear. These moments became warnings, retold in whispers as reminders of what happened to those who resisted openly. Fear tightened its grip, but so did resentment. Children grew up hearing these stories. They learned early that the world was not fair. Some became quiet observers, others grew angry. All of them learned to read signs adults could not speak aloud. They understood when danger was near. They understood when it was time to disappear into the background. The plantation became a place where two worlds existed at once. Above ground, there was order, productivity, and calm. Below that surface, there was grief, rage, and fear moving quietly through the community. The whispers connected people, reminding them they were not alone, even when they felt isolated. Faith leaders among the enslaved people played a powerful role. They spoke in coded language during prayers and songs, offering strength without drawing attention. Songs carried double meanings, one that overseers heard, and another that only the enslaved understood. These moments of shared belief became acts of resistance, even if they did not look like it from the outside.
The widow continued to believe she had created a perfect system. She measured success in numbers and silence. She never considered that silence could be a warning. She never considered that people who are forced to whisper are often waiting for a moment when they no longer have to. By now, the whispers were not just about survival, they were about memory. Elders made sure the truth was not lost. They knew that one day someone would ask what happened on that land, and when that day came, the truth would need to be remembered even if it could not be spoken yet. Some enslaved people began to secretly plan for the future. Escape was nearly impossible, but not unthinkable. Routes were discussed quietly. Names of safe places were passed along carefully. Most plans never came close to action, but planning itself was a form of hope. The sons sensed a shift they could not explain. The plantation felt heavier. The air felt tense. They dismissed it as superstition or exhaustion, but deep down they knew something was building. Systems built on fear often feel stable until the moment they are not. By the end of this part of the story, the plantation was held together by silence and whispers. Power rested in the main house, but truth lived in the cabins. And though no one could say it out loud yet, the enslaved people understood one thing clearly: silence would not last forever.
Outside the plantation gates, life in the nearby town continued as if nothing unusual was happening. Shops opened each morning, church bells rang on Sundays. Neighbors greeted one another politely and spoke about weather, crops, and prices. The plantation was known as successful, orderly, and profitable. That reputation alone protected it from deeper questions. Some people did notice things that felt strange. Traders who visited regularly saw the numbers growing faster than expected. They saw more children than usual, many born close together in age. A few made jokes about the widow's good fortune. Others raised an eyebrow, but said nothing more. In a world where human beings were bought and sold openly, unusual growth was not enough to cause outrage. Profit often silenced curiosity. The widow understood this very well. She knew how to present herself. When visitors came, she welcomed them calmly, dressed modestly, speaking softly. She never appeared harsh or emotional. She spoke like someone in full control. Men respected that. They believed a woman who managed her estate so efficiently must be doing something right. At church, she sat with her head bowed, listening closely to sermons about order, obedience, and God's will. When preachers spoke about morality, she nodded. When they spoke about kindness, she donated money. No one questioned her faith. No one asked how her success was achieved. Respectability became her shield. A few people felt uneasy, but lacked the courage to speak. A neighbor once mentioned to his wife that something didn't feel right about the plantation. She warned him not to involve himself. Another man suggested asking questions, but quickly changed his mind. Challenging a wealthy landowner, especially a widow with strong connections, was risky. Silence was safer. Even those who suspected the truth often justified their silence. They told themselves it was not their place. They told themselves slavery itself was the real problem, not one plantation. They told themselves they were powerless. Each excuse made it easier to look away. The legal system offered no protection to the enslaved people. Laws were written to protect property, not humanity. Birth records listed children as assets. Complaints from enslaved people were ignored or punished. There was no court that would hear their pain. The system worked exactly as it was designed to. The widow understood the law better than most. She knew where its limits were and how far she could go without crossing lines that mattered to white society. She stayed just inside those boundaries. That was her skill. Not kindness, control. Occasionally, a preacher's words came close to truth. One Sunday, a sermon spoke about sins hidden behind respectability.
Some people shifted uncomfortably in their seats. The widow did not. She sat still, calm, unbothered. After church, she thanked the preacher politely. The moment passed. Nothing changed. In the town, gossip focused on harmless things. Who was marrying whom, who had lost money, who had gained land. People preferred simple stories. The truth of the plantation was complicated and ugly, and most people did not want to carry that weight. Meanwhile, the enslaved people knew exactly how alone they were. They understood that no help was coming from outside. If freedom ever arrived, it would not come from neighbors or churches. This knowledge was painful, but it was also clarifying. Hope shifted inward. Strength came from community, not rescue. The sons occasionally went into town. They drank, laughed, and talked with other young men. No one challenged them. No one asked questions. They felt protected by their status. That protection made it easier to ignore the discomfort they carried inside. Society's silence became their permission. As years passed, the plantation's reputation only grew stronger. More land was acquired, more money flowed in. Success rewrote memory. People remembered what they wanted to remember. The rest faded into background noise. But silence has a cost. The more the town looked away, the more the system on the plantation hardened. No outside pressure meant no reason to change. Cruelty continued not because everyone approved of it, but because too many people chose comfort over truth. There were moments when the truth nearly escaped. A trader drank too much and spoke too freely. A visiting cousin asked too many questions. Each time, the widow redirected the conversation. She smiled, she corrected gently, and the moment closed again. By the end of this stage, it was clear that the plantation did not survive in isolation. It survived because it was surrounded by people willing to look away. Silence was not just inside the gates. It stretched into the town, the church, and the law itself. And that silence would later become part of the story too. Because when the truth finally surfaced, it would not only expose one woman and her sons, it would expose everyone who saw, suspected, and chose not to speak. When the Civil War finally reached Georgia, the plantation felt the change before freedom ever arrived. The steady rhythm of profit began to break. Cotton prices dropped. Trade routes weakened. Men left to fight, and fear entered places that once felt untouchable. For the first time in years, the widow could not control everything with a ledger. At first, she believed the war would pass like a storm. She told herself the South would survive, that her planning had prepared her for anything. But as months turned into years, the truth became harder to ignore. Supplies grew scarce, overseers left, authority weakened. The quiet fear that once belonged only to the enslaved people began creeping into the main house. The sons felt it too. They were no longer protected by routine. The world outside the plantation was changing, and the rules their mother had taught them no longer felt solid. Rumors of emancipation spread quickly. Enslaved people whispered not just about survival now, but about leaving, about life beyond the gates. Hope, once dangerous, began to feel possible. When the war ended, freedom did not arrive gently. It arrived like a crack through stone. Word spread fast that slavery was over, that chains were broken by law, that people were no longer property. On the plantation, confusion ruled. Some enslaved people were afraid to believe it. Others packed what little they had immediately. No one waited for permission. The widow tried to hold on. She argued with officials. She claimed contracts and debts. She insisted order must be maintained. But the law no longer stood on her side. The ledger that once gave her power became useless. Names and numbers meant nothing without ownership behind them. One by one, people left the plantation. Some walked away quietly, some shouted, some cried. Families reunited, others searched desperately for loved ones lost long ago. The cabins emptied, the fields went untended. The silence that followed was different from before. It was no longer fear, it was absence. The sons felt it too. The system that had shaped them was gone. Without it, they were left to face themselves. Guilt surfaced where routine once hid it. Some tried to leave Georgia altogether. Others drank. One avoided mirrors. None of them spoke openly about what they had done. Silence remained their shield, even as it began to feel heavy. The widow aged quickly during this time. Her confidence faded. The control she once held slipped away day by day. She watched the plantation collapse around her and could not understand why her careful planning had failed. In her mind, she had done everything right. The world was wrong for changing. She died a few years later, not in disgrace, but not in glory either. There were no public accusations, no trials. Her death passed quietly, noted only in local records. To the town, she was remembered as a strong woman who survived difficult times. The truth of her actions remained buried. After her death, the plantation was divided, sold, and reshaped. Buildings were torn down or repurposed. Fields were claimed by new owners. The physical space changed, but traces of the past remained. Old ledgers were scattered, some destroyed, some forgotten in attics and courthouses. The sons disappeared from public life. One moved north, another changed his name. The third stayed close but lived quietly, avoiding attention. None of them spoke openly about the past. Their silence became part of the inheritance they carried, heavy and unshared. For the freed people, life was not easy, but it was theirs. Some stayed nearby, working for wages. Others moved far away, chasing family and opportunity. They carried stories with them, stories of pain, survival, and truth. These stories were told to children and grandchildren, not loudly, but clearly. Memory became resistance. Years passed, decades passed. The town grew and changed. New generations walked the land without knowing what had happened there. But history has a way of leaving marks beneath the surface. In courthouse files, in church records, in half-burned ledgers, clues remained. Eventually, historians began asking questions. They noticed unusual birth records, missing names, strange patterns. Oral histories from descendants filled gaps that paper could not. Piece by piece, the hidden truth surfaced. What they found was not just the story of one woman and her sons. It was the story of a system that allowed cruelty to hide behind law and silence. A system that protected power and punished vulnerability. A system that depended on people looking away. By the end of this part of the story, the plantation was gone, but its legacy remained, not in buildings or land, but in memory. And once remembered, the truth could no longer be controlled by ledgers, silence, or fear.
Many years after the plantation had disappeared from maps and memory, the land itself looked ordinary. Trees had grown where fields once stretched wide. New houses stood where cabins had been. People passed through without knowing what had happened there. Time had covered the surface, but it had not erased the past. The truth began to return slowly, not through one discovery, but through many small ones. A historian studying old county records noticed something unusual. Birth logs from the plantation showed strange patterns: too many children, too close together, and often without fathers listed. At first, it looked like a mistake. Then another record showed the same thing, and another. At the same time, descendants of formerly enslaved families were sharing stories that had been passed down quietly for generations. These stories were never written at first. They were told at kitchen tables, during reunions, and in moments of trust. Elders spoke of fear, of silence, of a woman who ruled with calm cruelty. For years, these stories were dismissed as exaggerations or pain-filled memories, but now the records were starting to match the words. Researchers began connecting pieces. Old ledgers were found in storage rooms and attics. Some pages were missing, others were damaged, but enough remained to reveal intent. Notes written in careful handwriting, calculations made beside names, children listed as assets. It became clear that what had happened was not random or accidental. It had been planned. The more historians uncovered, the harder it became to deny the truth. Articles were written, local talks were held. At first, there was resistance. Some people in the town did not want the story told. They feared what it would say about their past, about their families, about themselves. But history does not disappear just because it makes people uncomfortable. Descendants of the enslaved people felt something different. For many, the uncovering of the truth was painful, but also validating. The whispers they had grown up hearing were finally being taken seriously. Their ancestors' suffering was no longer invisible. It had a place in history now. The woman at the center of the story was no longer seen as just a strong widow or a successful landowner. She was understood as someone who used the system of slavery to its darkest limits, not through loud violence, but through planning and silence. Her sons were no longer just footnotes. They were recognized as part of that system, shaped by it, and responsible within it. What shocked many people most was not just what happened, but how long it remained hidden. The town had lived beside the truth for years and chosen not to see it. Churches had preached morality while ignoring suffering. Laws had protected property over people. Silence had done as much harm as cruelty. As the story spread, it became part of a larger conversation about history, about how slavery was not only chains and whips, but also ledgers and quiet rooms. About how women, often seen only as victims of the system, could also be its architects. About how evil does not always look loud or wild. Sometimes it looks calm, organized, and respectable. Schools began teaching the story and broader lessons about slavery, not to shame, but to understand. Museums included references. Descendants visited the land, standing quietly where their ancestors had once stood in fear. Some cried, some felt anger, some felt relief. Memory has many shapes. The story did not offer neat justice. There were no trials, no punishments handed down. Those responsible were long gone. But something else happened instead. Truth replaced silence. Names replaced numbers. Lives replaced ledgers. For the descendants of the enslaved, telling the story became an act of strength. It was a way to honor those who survived and those who did not. For the wider world, it became a reminder of what systems of power can hide when people choose comfort over courage. Today, the plantation exists only in fragments, records, stories, and the ground itself. But its lesson remains clear. History is not just made by loud events. It is shaped by quiet decisions, repeated over time, protected by silence. The hidden truth of Georgia in 1847 was not only about one woman and her sons. It was about a society that allowed cruelty to grow because it was profitable, legal, and easy to ignore. Remembering that truth does not change the past, but it changes how the future is understood. And that is why the story matters. Because once the truth is seen clearly, it can no longer be buried again.